This morning, Dr. Joseph Schumann will be our speaker. He has been the leader of the Ethical Culture Society of Bergen County, New Jersey since 1974, and since 2008 has served as a part-time leader of the New York Society for Ethical Culture. Dr. Schumann teaches human rights at the graduate level at Columbia University and has taught at the United Nations University for Peace in San Jose, Costa Rica. He has published numerous articles in the Record of Bergen County, New Jersey. Joe recently announced his upcoming retirement for the end of this December, and we are honored and privileged to hear him speak this morning. His topic will be an ethical blueprint for America. And now, please welcome Joe Schumann. Please unmute yourself, Joe.
Yeah, or else I'm going to look like a ventriloquist. Yeah, thank you very much, Susan. It's so good to be with you all. I mean, I really am extraordinarily moved by the solidarity that this community has expressed, support for one another at really a very difficult and challenging time when that mutual support and solidarity is in greatest need. I think we've risen to the occasion and doing such a nice job in terms of reaching out to one another. That's what we're about, humanism and human support. And we're doing such a marvelous job. And of course, keeping the engine running, and our programs are extraordinarily robust, and we're really doing what we ought to do. We're actually functioning much better than the United States is at this moment. So we can give ourselves a lot of credit, which is in part sort of what I want to talk about this morning. I have a lot of disparate ideas that I put together, and I don't know how coherently they will all fit. I always try to bring coherence to my address without dangling ideas and so on and so forth. I try to tie it together. You know, if you're like me, you're summoning your will to try to take your anxiety and put it in the corner of your mind to bracket it. We're coming down to the wire. And I'm sure myself, virtually all of you are sitting at the edge of your seat, you know, hoping for the best after this week passes. So I can't help, given the moment, to address again that topic and try to basically provide not only an analysis of where we are, but I think where we need to go and where we need to be in order to establish a more promising future for our American society. I think we confront an American society that we've never, in fact, experienced before. We stand, as you know, at an ominous crossroads, and will soon discover whether American democracy will continue to fall over a precipice towards decline, or will be given a chance to rebuild and renew our society, and so inhabit a more promising future, a future which you would agree we deserve. The American landscape is deeply fractured, and our social fabric is frayed. Americans are turned against each other with contempt and dismissal that we have not witnessed in our lifetimes. It is my fervent hope that we will be given a chance to overcome these problems and restore sanity, reason, decency, and goodwill to American society. I passionately want to see us on the right track. I'm sure we all do. I never thought that I would see basic decency, a commitment to reason, and reality over fantasy as central political issues in a presidential campaign. But astoundingly, friends, this is where we've arrived. Many of us stand in amazement at how much damage one man could do to a nation in such a short period of time. As we all know, Donald Trump, among his tens of millions of followers, has normalized cynicism and hatred, distrust among one another, our institutions, and distrust of basic norms, and has fomented division, racism, and violence. There is simply no bottom to what he will do or say, no moral bottom, that is. Of course, it is not our president alone, but his minion of enablers who have been self-serving and craven, I believe, in the pursuit of their narrow interests. And in so doing, they have put their petty and selfish designs before their love of democracy, fealty to our Constitution, and devotion to their country, which they have sworn to protect. They seem to have no conscience. The moral blight in our society, coming from a multitude of so-called political leaders, is so shameful, I think, as to be virtually beyond belief. But the damage to our society at this moment is built on problems, I contend, that long predate the current administration. conditions that have long been brewing, at least for the past 40 years. Some may put the origins earlier. The realities of which I speak will require a restructuring of our economy. They will involve an infusion of new, broadly sweeping political programs put in place by our federal government, and an invigorated politics emerging as well from the bottom up, that is, on the grassroots. But underlying a new politics and new economics, I contend there needs to be a dramatic rebirth of ethical visions and moral values in American society. We often think of morality as operating in the smaller personal spheres of life. We think of doing the right thing by our friends and our acquaintances, and we think of morality when choices are to be undertaken and we reflect on those moral dilemmas. But I contend that morality is something much larger and grander than that. Morality is the mortar, is in fact the mortar that holds society together. Economic theories and programs, political policies, and even laws themselves cannot of themselves bind society together unless certain moral values and dispositions are present in the hearts of women and men. We need to cultivate what the sociologist Robert Bellah had referred to as, quote, habits of the heart, a sense of civic virtue that orients all Americans to society as a whole. Economic and political policies, even laws, will not bind society together unless a strong element of social trust is present behind those policies. If people in society are radically distrustful of social institutions and each other, society falls apart, no matter how intelligently designed those institutions might be. Likewise, people as a whole need to believe in the first instance that their fellow members of society are primarily, not exclusively, but primarily honest and truthful unless proven otherwise. If people assume that their fellow human beings are for the most part deceptive and conniving and dishonest with them, then there can be no trust and society quickly erodes. Another way to state this is that we need a thickening of what political theorists refer to as, quote, social capital. Social capital. What is social capital? Writing in today's paper, in fact, Nicholas Kristof stated, quote, I'm a great believer in community, in the idea that what makes countries strong is social capital. That is the web of relationships, beliefs, trust, decency, and identity that make a society work. Trump, he says, has taken this social fabric and acted as the great unraveler. Trump has been a corrosive acid on America's social capital. He has cost us trust. He has dissolved our connectivity, end quote. It is a restoration of that connectivity, I should say, that is the guiding thesis of my talk this morning. My point is that the moral values we hold determine the type of society we have. But the moral values that comprise the centerpiece of my talk this morning, though closely related, are not exclusively trust or honesty, though these values, needless to say, are simply essential. I'm concerned with moral values of a somewhat different kind. My contention is that for at least 4 decades, American society has embraced a morality centered on individual affirmation, aggrandizement, and enrichment at the expense of the collective flourishing of our society as a whole. In the most concise terms, we have suffered for too long, I believe, from what I would call, quote, hyper-individualism. In short, we have become a people overly preoccupied with, quote, I, as opposed to, quote, we. It is my assertion that a renewal of American society and a reconstruction of our democracy needs to place in the forefront of its priorities a commitment to what is often referred to as, quote, the common good. I'm a strong believer in the common good. In short, we need a greater infusion of altruism, which is a centerpiece of social capital, to help heal the frayed social fabric that we endure. I need to assert a caveat, however, before I begin on the road of critiquing individualism and, moreover, hyper-individualism. And I've articulated this before. And that is, I remain a staunch defender of the rights of the individual. I think we all need to be forever vigilant in defending our individual rights if we are to preserve our basic freedoms and liberties. Rights are vested in the individual. The individual is the rights holder. And politically, we need to assert those rights to remain a free people. We should always be prepared to assert the right to dissent when dissent is called for. And we should be prepared as individuals to stand against majority opinion when that majority opinion, we believe in good conscience, is poised to do harm. Again, rights are vested in the individual person, and they are simply invaluable. If one is a member of a marginalized or oppressed class, the assertion of one's rights, in fact, one finds is very liberating and exhilarating. For the past 70 years, much of the world, and America too, has experienced what we might call a rights revolution, as increasing circles of disenfranchised people, women, racial minorities, indigenous people, gays, and the disabled have leveraged greater visibility and greater equality. The rights revolution, I believe, has been a very good thing, and I think is a true mark of human progress, which I believe too often gets lost and unnoticed and underappreciated. But there is another side to the social equation. As we recognize our individual rights, no less we need to be mindful of our responsibilities and obligations to others and to society. And indeed, I believe there can be no real freedom outside of society, which ensures that we are responsive and responsible to others. As individuals, we do not stand outside of society or over against society, but are deeply enmeshed in it. What we are and who we become is greatly a product of the endowments we receive from others, and I believe that we need to give in return that which we have received. It is this social side of the equation that I think has tragically atrophied in American life, to the extent that our society has become stridently divided and again woefully frayed. Not only division, but an epidemic of loneliness that has pervaded the American landscape as people find themselves increasingly alone without the social and institutional ties that have been characteristic of American life. And on a grander scale, what has been lost is the binding sense of the American people as a whole, people who belong to a common national community and therefore share in some sense a common destiny. If American society is to heal, and beyond that indeed flourish, I think we need a new moral vision that we are all in this together. This will require a new spiritual and moral awakening, which will pervade our political, economic, and social life, emanating from government, that is from the federal government, the highest precincts of government on down, as well as at the local level in which we more substantially and palpably live out our lives. When it comes to the fraying of American society, others may place again its origins differently, but I see, in fact, and I can't help but be political here, I can't help but see the Reagan era as a major inflection point in American values and moral sensibilities writ large. It was Reagan who pulled out virtually all the stops on the free market, which of course is based on the enrichment, on the idea of profit and enrichment for individuals and individual corporations, valorized the business culture. We were supposed to see our business leaders as heroes. He valorized and raised to the pinnacle of American interest materialism and consumerism, and elevated the accumulation of wealth, again, to the heights of virtuous achievement. And behind these powerful dynamics is a rampant individualism. Again, the virtue of I over and above we. It was Reagan who propelled the destruction of labor unions in the United States when on August 5th, 1981, he fired more than 11,000 air traffic controllers who went on strike to demand better pay and working conditions. That was a bit of a shock. I mean, air traffic controllers provide a very essential service. And we thought that, in effect, they were going to be able to bargain for better wages and better working conditions. It's an incredibly stressful job. And it seemed to me at that time, as I remember 40 years ago, their demands were totally reasonable. And yet Reagan indeed summarily and shockingly fired them all, which initiated the beginning of the decline of serious decline of unionism in American life. In my view, the American middle class was built after World War II in great measure on the foundations of the union movement, however corrupt it often is. Okay, back then, more than 30% of the labor force was unionized. Today, it's less than 10%. And with the erosion of unions, bargaining power has been shifted from workers to owners and corporate leadership. That created a change in American society and a change as to where wealth indeed is placed and located. As a result, much greater wealth is concentrated, as we know, in the hands of the super rich at the top of the economic ladder, while the middle class is eroding and falling out the bottom. And 40% of Americans pre-pandemic have struggled to pay their monthly rent, and the poor have in effect have become invisible altogether. I mean, it politically became unfashionable for presidential candidates, I look at Bill Clinton, to basically talk about the poor because he was talking to the middle class, and the middle class felt that it was suffering enough and it could not bear the weight, in effect, of being able to engage in largesse and generosity to those who were poor. So the poor basically fell off the table altogether in terms of political discourse. That was not true in the 60s, for example, when we had under Johnson a war on poverty and so on. That, in effect, seems to be long gone. Too many Americans have been stuck in isolated and low-paying jobs without benefits, without security, often with unpredictable hours and without dignity. That, in effect, exists in the wake of the destruction, I think, of unions. It's changed the landscape of the American labor force. The wealth gap, I think, is egregious and, in fact, very bad for democracy. It's bad for democracy because it has closed the doors on economic advancement and has spurred hopelessness among tens of millions of Americans. That's part of the Trump phenomenon. And when people feel hopeless, they turn inward to shore up their identities with those holding views that reinforce their own. Hence the centripetal vectors of parochialism and tribalism that augment the divisions in American society. When people are anxious about their economic security, when reality doesn't work for them anymore, they become more vulnerable to irrational ideas and can readily fall prey to conspiracy theories and extremist ideologies. When people are isolated, they are also, in fact, more vulnerable to the lure of authoritarianism. When our social institutions at the grassroots are stronger and they become frayed, that serves as a bulwark against authoritarianism. When people are scattered and isolated, authoritarianism basically can extend itself as a predator to people, in effect, left more vulnerable in their isolation. But the wealth gap also allows the wealthy and super wealthy to buy their way out of the conditions that the rest of us are compelled to reside in. They can escape our neighborhoods and public spaces by retreating into gated communities. They can have their kids opt out of public schools by sending them to Tony private schools. They can buy membership in country clubs and avoid associating with us in public parks. And they can buy even private seats at extraordinary cost at sports arenas at phenomenal prices, and avoid contact with average men and women. Used to be the case when the average guy, the janitor, went to Yankee Stadium or Shea Stadium or any other ballpark, he or she was sitting next to the boss man or the owner, and so on and so forth. Those days are gone. The wealthy can now buy at tremendous rates very luxurious private seats where they have their own dinners, socialize with their own, but not with us. In short, the wealth gap has eroded public spaces wherein people of different classes and backgrounds would see each other, meet, even perhaps interact, and reinforce the knowledge and appreciation that we live in a common society and in some sense, again, share common interests. In other words, with the wealth gap that separates the super wealthy from the rest of us has come increased privatization. in American life, which further erodes the values and practices of democracy. I think privatization is one of the real creeping evils in an American society that is really fostered by the type of economy that we've created. But Reagan also introduced the idea and inculcated it into the minds of too many Americans that government, in fact, is our enemy. It's a pernicious idea. This idea is as divisive and as poisonous as it is mistaken. In autocracies, governments indeed are the enemies of the people. But by definition, in a democracy, which we're supposed to be, government is the collective expression of the people. And the federal government is the collective expression of the American people as a whole. In short, in a democracy, the government is the people. If Americans are going to restore their sense of government as benign and not as an enemy, then we must regain a vision of the government that binds us together into a single national community. So where to begin? If the election turns out as it needs to, and I fervently hope it does, we will have an opportunity, I believe, for a new start. And I'm, in effect, hopeful if we can turn the page. I think there's a lot of people ready to roll up their sleeves. There's a new moral awakening, which is part of my message in America, and people want to rebuild this society anew from the ground up. You know, I'm always reminded, having been a student of the classics, that before Odysseus could return home and complete his mission, he had to descend to the underworld first before he could ascend. Okay, I think we're there. I think we've reached the lower strata, the lower circles of hell, and we're ready, in effect, to return and restore ourselves to our mission. And of course, in Greek mythology, which I love, the phoenix, of course, is consumed by fire and is reborn out of its own ashes. And I think we need to return, be reborn phoenix-like. Okay, so much for mythology. If we are to see government in positive terms, it will be because we have a government that successfully meets, I believe, the most basic needs of all the American people, including the need to feel secure economically now in the future. I think an impetus to a new moral vision, in effect, is vested and correlative with the fulfillment of economic needs. Again, I'm not an economic determinist, but I think economics helps to mold our values to perhaps more than any other social phenomenon. This can only happen again if we temper our liberalism with a sense of the common good. The right government programs, very generous and well deployed, can help nurture, I believe, this sensibility. I want to suggest what the future needs to be by turning for a moment to the past. I want to introduce specifically a speech given by President Franklin Roosevelt, which I believe implies the visions and values that I'm referencing. By implication, I think what we need to restore in our economic life is a modern, updated version adjusted to the needs of this time. What we need is a New Deal. And I look, in effect, for inspiration to the 1930s and Franklin Roosevelt and that era. Many Americans are familiar, I think, with Roosevelt's Four Freedoms speech, which was given as his State of the Union in 1941. In that speech, Roosevelt articulated four freedoms that he believes should characterize a post-war world. Namely, the four freedoms were the freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. That were the four freedoms. But here's my point. Roosevelt gave another State of the Union address, which unfortunately is not as well known, but in my opinion, should be resurrected and strenuously promoted in our times. It was his last State of the Union address, given in 1944, as the end of the war was in sight and not long before his death. Roosevelt at that point was noticeably pretty ill. He was in his last months. It is often, that other State of the Union address is often referred to as, quote, the Second Bill of Rights speech, in which Roosevelt called for a second Bill of Rights that would guarantee basic economic rights in addition to the political rights that are outlined in our first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Very interesting. To be clear, Roosevelt was not calling for us to literally amend the US Constitution, which is a politically very arduous and fraught procedure. But what he was calling for was a series of federal laws that would guarantee certain economic entitlements for all Americans. It is my belief that it is this vision that was possible to articulate 75 years ago, which has become buried as the United States has moved further to the right, and it's that vision that we were able to entertain 75 years ago, but not since, that needs to be reborn and rekindled in the American spirit and become part of political and economic discourse. What I'd like to do is read from that speech, which I find very illuminating and very inspiring. Roosevelt said, quote, "It is our duty now," this is 1944, "it is our duty now to begin to lay the plans and determine the strategy for winning a lasting peace and the establishment of an American standard of living higher than ever before known. We cannot be content, no matter how high that general standard of living may be, if some fraction of our people, whether it be 1/3 or 1/5 or 1/10, is ill-fed, ill-clothed, ill-housed, and insecure. As our nation has grown in size and stature, however, as our industrial economy expanded, these political rights proved inadequate to assure us equality in the pursuit of happiness. We have come to a clear realization," he says, "of the fact that true individual freedom cannot exist without economic security and independence." He says, quote, "Necessitous men are not free men." Bet you never heard the word necessitous, right? Necessitous men are not free men. People who are hungry and out of a job are the stuff of which dictatorships are made. In our day, these economic truths have become accepted as self-evident. We have accepted, so to speak, a second Bill of Rights under which a new basis of security and prosperity can be established for all, regardless of station, race, or creed. Among these are, and then Roosevelt lays out the following 8 entitlements. Quote, "The right to a useful and remunerative job in the industries or shops or farms or mines of the nation. Second, the right to earn enough to provide adequate food and clothing and recreation. Third, the right of every farmer to raise and sell his products at a return which will give him and his family a decent living. Next, the right of every businessman, large and small, to trade in an atmosphere of freedom, free from unfair competition and domination by monopolies at home or abroad. The right of every family to a decent home. The right of adequate," listen to this, friends, "the right to adequate medical care and opportunity to achieve and enjoy good health, universal health care. The right to adequate protection from economic fears of old age, sickness, accident, and unemployment. The right to a good education. All of these rights," Roosevelt says, "spell security. And after this war is won, we must be prepared to move forward in the implementation of these rights to new goals of human happiness and well-being." He concludes by saying, "America's own rightful place in the world depends in large part upon how fully these and similar rights have been carried into practice for our citizens." End quote. In short, if America can indeed fulfill these economic entitlements for all its citizens, we will be the envy of the world. It will situate us more favorably in the global community. That's the end of the speech. When Roosevelt says, quote, "We have come to a clear realization of the fact that true individual freedom cannot exist without economic security and independence, and necessitous men are not free men," Okay, people who are hungry and out of a job are the stuff of which dictatorships are made. He was giving expression to the compelling idea that our political rights and our economic rights are mutually interdependent. Unless people are economically secure, they cannot exercise their political freedoms, and unless they are politically free, they cannot agitate for their economic well-being. When he says, quote, people who are hungry and out of a job are the stuff of which dictatorships are made, I am sure his fellow Americans who are listening in their kitchen on their radios had thoughts of Nazi Germany coursing through their minds. But today, when I read that, I think of the dark clouds of authoritarianism on our American horizons that I feel too many Americans are caught up in and caught in the grip, who are caught up in the grip of economic insecurity, are just too open to accept. To be clear, Roosevelt failed in his effort to have America adopt a second Bill of Rights. As America turned more conservative, okay, and I look at, boy, the administrations of Ronald Reagan, and I put Bill Clinton in that, in that camp. I think he did more to valorize business and eviscerate liberalism and liberal ideas than a lot of people. I look at George W. Bush, and now the culmination of Donald Trump, we've moved more conservative. What we're left with is a patchwork of economic entitlements that are subject to the vagaries of capitalism and politics. While Roosevelt failed to have these economic entitlements encoded into our federal laws, 4 years later, his widow Eleanor, who chaired the drafting committee that created the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, helped ensure that these economic rights were factored into that declaration, so that that highly influential document vouchsafes now for all the world's people economic rights in parallel with political rights. The nations of Western Europe, however strained their economies these days, did and do take these economic rights seriously. They recognize, as we do not, that the rights of all their citizens to housing, food, even a paid vacation, and of course healthcare, are entitlements that all their citizens can claim simply because they are human beings. And it's the responsibility of society as a whole to ensure that they do. Again, it is an expression of the morality of we ahead of I writ large, and the social democracies of Europe entail that overarching, okay, moral umbrella. We do not. Let me just say, in terms of human rights, and it's the field in which I work academically, the United States officially does not recognize economic rights as human rights. We recognize political rights, but not economic rights. All the nations of Europe and many countries beyond recognize the legitimacy of economic rights, which entails the government to feel responsible to meet the basic economic needs of its citizens. We do not make that commitment. That's why I remember in 2012, in the third debate between John McCain and Barack Obama, when the moderator asked them, do you believe that healthcare is a right? Okay, McCain said no. Okay, and Obama said yes. European statesmen for the longest time would not say that. I mean, healthcare is understood, as well as a whole range of economic entitlements, are understood as basic rights, which means it's the government's responsibility to meet those claims. Okay, the United States does not officially recognize economic rights as rights. Okay, they are matters of privilege, and again, subject to the vagaries of our capital system, the market, and the politics of the day. To put it bluntly, what the Universal Declaration proclaims and what the European states exemplify is, in fact, to be honest, a social welfare state. That is, if the economies of their countries cannot provide the economic wherewithal for their citizens to live a basic life of dignity, then it is the obligation of the state, which means all of us, to make sure that people can and do. Behind this economic and political arrangement, again, is a morality that speaks not to the aggrandizement of the individual foremost, but to the common good of society. There are those who argue that given the distinctiveness of American culture, with its prevailing emphasis on the individual, And given our politics, such an arrangement is simply utopian and impossible for us to attain. But I would say that unless we are willing to put forward these visions, they will never happen. That our aspirations need to exceed our reach, or we're simply just reconfirming the status quo. Cultures, in fact, are not static. They're not static entities. Cultures change. And I sense that there is now a new moral awakening of borning in America that should place this type of notion, this type of morality and economics on the agenda. The point, again, is that we need robust federal programs, not merely to line the pockets of Americans with more financial and material wealth. Individual enrichment is not the primary point. The point is that we need to cultivate the sensibility that we share a common society and that we have a responsibility to ensure that all our citizens can feel and be secure and live a life of human flourishing to the greatest extent possible. My ethical culture tells me that. Our responsibilities are not just for our individual selves alone, but extend outward to ensure the well-being of all others who share in our common society. The way we express this is to lend ourselves to a politics that speaks to economic justice and economic equity, to build those programs that will provide economic security for all. But to do that, we need to cultivate moral values that will inspire that politics. If we can bring economic security to Americans through generous and efficient federal entitlements beyond political rights alone, we will bring America to a richer and fuller democracy. Again, to do this, we need to move from a focus on simply I to an emphasis on, quote, we. Democracy is as democracy does, and it plays itself out on the plane of our federal government. Democracy deals with the big picture, but I would argue that democracy is more substantially experienced in the smaller spheres of life, in our neighborhoods and in our associations closer to home. It is here that the moral emphasis on we, as opposed to I, is more directly and more powerfully felt. Democracy, as I understand it, is more than merely a political form. It's rather a way of life. It is to feel ourselves part of a larger whole. It is active engagement in the life and welfare of the communities of which we are a part. It was a belief of the great humanist and philosopher of democracy, John Dewey, that through engaging with others in community towards common projects to the betterment of those so dedicated, we progressively transform ourselves and mold our own characters. He believed that a person develops his or her capacities fully only by exercising them in and through responding to the needs of a community. Moreover, he believed that there was no greater joy than experiencing a sense of common purpose and solidarity with others when working towards common ends. Democratic action in this sense is the essence of shared experience. It is the way in which we can feel a sense of belonging in a community with others and strengthen the human bond. Democracy is more than a political phenomenon, as I'm saying. It is a social and moral experience that brings us into community with others in ways that enrich our lives and pushes ahead the welfare of all of us, others as well as ourselves. The most palpable arena for the exercise of democracy, so understood, is the realm of what is referred to often as, quote, civil society. Civil society is that stratum of society that exists between government on the one hand and business on the other. Civil society is the private realm in which people, volunteers, engage not only with one another in social and family relations, but also when they engage in local community and political action, activism in their neighborhoods. Working for nonprofit organizations, doing charity work, organizing to stop a plant in your neighborhood that will burn fossil fuels, protesting against systemic racism, working to build a local library or serving on its board, or working to improve the quality of your neighborhood public schools, getting involved in local political campaigns, or even coaching your kid's soccer team are all manifestations of action that takes place in civil society. And the more that people are so engaged, the stronger our democracy is. People so involved also tend to be politically better informed and indeed when it comes to the larger issues, tend to vote more often. That's been empirically demonstrated. Bringing this home, and here I want to make this directly relevant to us, because I think we're very relevant. Bringing this home, I think that our ethical society does in fact have something of great importance to contribute at this moment when we feel that our democracy is imperiled. I think we are more important than we often give ourselves credit for. We are important not because we are big and powerful. We are not. We are important because what we are and what we do and what we model, and because we provide, again, a living example of what I think society needs very badly. What I mean is that ethical culture compellingly reflects this model of democracy that I'm trying to outline. We are a democratic community for sure. We are a community in which members come together to support one another and reinforce the moral values we hold. But our democratic commitment also faces outward to the broader society, a broader community, and inspires us to action to improve our community in the world, of which we're an intrinsic part. We are a community of democratic action and engagement in the realm of civil society, in which we strive to transform the community and ourselves for the better. If ethical societies are something like them, were populated by the thousands throughout America, I think our nation's democratic fabric would be rendered much stronger. We in ethical culture, I think, have a very good, relevant, and powerful idea, and we need to hold on to it. We need to build it. In conclusion, a political renewal in America needs to be based on moral values and visions that inspire. We need massive and generous federal programs coming from above, and we need a thickening of domestic activism on the grassroots. We need a moral turning away from obsession with individual aggrandizement and towards a communitarian ethic of the common good. But in order to unite democracy from above and that from below, I think we need another ethical vision for America. And I've spoken about this before. What I propose is the following, and that is a new model of American society based on pluralism. Okay, I'm a pluralist, or what is often referred to as cosmopolitanism. I should say Felix Adler, our founder, was a social pluralist, as was John Dewey. And now the vision of cosmopolitanism is most fervently put forward by Anthony Appiah, who is a professor of philosophy at NYU, and some of you may recognize him as the ethicist in the ethics, for the ethics column in the New York Times. He's the major proponent of a vision of cosmopolitanism, and I buy into it. I think he's onto something very important. Okay, cosmopolitanism is neither a vision of America as a melting pot, which the Black Power movement years ago unmasked as a form of Anglo dominance. Okay, it's neither a vision of the melting pot, nor is it a full-throated commitment to multiculturalism, wherein different groups nurture their values and assert their politics through their identities, but don't necessarily build bridges to other peoples different from themselves. I think we have to recognize, in truth, that racially, ethnically, and religiously, people will choose to a greater or less extent to be socialized in their own communities from which they receive much of their identity and seek to affirm the values that so mold them. That's really the basis of multiculturalism. But at the same time, I believe that people can indeed affirm a commitment, a larger commitment to the whole, that is to America as a national community, and beyond that, even to humanity as a whole. People carry within them, I think, multiple identities. We're not just one thing. It's an interesting reflection, just to reflect sometimes a meditation, to look at where you come from and look at all the ethnicities that you carry within you that have helped to make you up. I mean, we are all a product of what my mentor Cornel West referred to as radical hybridity. We are all hybrids. We are not just one thing. Okay, and I think it's useful and to recognize that. And I think if people basically recognize their hybridity and that in others, they recognize part of themselves in others, and we wouldn't have such thick walls dividing one from the other by ethnicity and religion. We have more in common than I think we realize. I believe a person can indeed hold two allegiances at the same time. And a universal commitment does not necessarily cancel out local ones. We can affirm our more parochial allegiances while recognizing and respecting the humanity of all people, however different they may be from us. Indeed, I believe we can and must live within the tension between, to be fancy about it, the tension between the particular and the universal, if divisions that so poison our society are to be mitigated, if not overcome. As a final word, ethical culture has something to offer us here as well. Our founder, Felix Adler, had a somewhat esoteric view of reality, which he called the ethical manifold, a clumsy term. In his technical philosophy, I find it a reality, his origins for this idea, difficult to accept. But as a metaphor for structuring human society, I find his concept of reality, of humanity, inspiring and in fact very useful. In most basic terms, he believed that we are all distinctive and unique individuals, but at the very same time, we are also social beings who are organically connected to all other human beings in a vast interdependent web of humanity. If you asked Felix Adler, are human beings primarily social rather than individual, so that the individual becomes absorbed, let's say, into the community, as Karl Marx would have it? He would say no. If you said, is the individual primarily an individual over and above community, he would say no to that also. He believed that people, and I think this is not a contradiction, are both individual and social at the same time. We are all individuals distinct from each other and unique, and that was a centerpiece of this notion of human worth. Replicas or clones would be expendable. It's our distinctiveness that gives us our ultimate value. We are all individuals in that sense, but we're individuals that are intrinsically and deeply enmeshed and connected in the web of humanity. We are connected to all others, okay? And because we are intrinsically social, we all bear responsibilities to all other persons and to the human community as a whole. And so when we act to do right by others and by society as a whole, when we act on behalf of the common good, we therefore, because we're all interconnected, we reciprocally bring out the best in ourselves. Giving outwardly to our fellow human beings, in other words, is not a zero-sum game. When we give to others, we do not diminish ourselves. Rather, we strengthen the human bond and strengthen and enrich ourselves when we do. I simply cannot think of a better example of this ethical schema than the pandemic and what morality demands of us. When we indeed engage in masking and social distancing, okay, we are protecting others. But by protecting others, we are working on behalf of the common good because we're helping to flatten the virus, and I hope we do, flatten the virus in society as a whole. And when we bring down the virus in society as a whole, in effect, we therefore make ourselves safer. So giving outwardly to others with the proper behavior enhances the common good and reciprocally brings benefits for us as individuals as well. It's the perfect, I can't think of a better example of that ethical schema, which I think we need to broaden into multiple aspects of life, okay? As a final word, let me say, I think in this sense, our ethical culture tradition provides us with a beautiful vision of democracy. If given a chance, we can strive to realize this vision as we move to an unknown, and I would deeply hope, much more benign future. Let us, as I said in the beginning, try to take our anxiety, place it in the corner of our minds, okay, and let us have faith in ourselves, and let us indeed keep hope alive. Thanks a lot, friends. May we have a good week. May we get to the other side safely and securely. Okay, I feel like I'm crossing the river Styx. Okay, I want to get to the other side in safety. I hope we all do. I hope for the benefit of our country, okay, that we make it to the other side in safety. And when we do, we've got a lot of work. Okay, there we are. Thank you very much, friends. Yeah,
Thank you very much, Joe.
You're very welcome. Yeah.
We do have some time for questions and answers, so I'm going to invite people to raise their hands electronically. And I'm going to remind people that we are looking for questions posed succinctly, and that we're looking for possible different voices than we always hear. So I have the first question from posed by Carol Hausner and Jonathan.
Oh.
Go ahead, Carol. You may unmute yourself.
Okay, I think we're
Hi, Jonathan and Carol. Such a thrill to see you. Hi, how are you?
Good. It's great to see you and everyone.
Oh, yeah.
It's really great to hear you too.
How's your daughter?
Good, thanks. She's okay.
Great.
Yeah, Jonathan actually has some kind of a question, I guess.
yeah, my question is, you know, obviously the choir is here listening. How do we spread the song? One thing that exists that didn't exist with Roosevelt is this social media, which is really good at calcifying those that are already calcified. So how do we penetrate this ability to go find what you need to support what you believe without any outside, you know, influencers or even just civil social discussion?
Well, you can turn off your computer. That's one thing if you want to avoid, right? You just don't have to look at it. That's a whole other discourse, and I think really deserves a, you know, a platform address or two of its own, and that is the effect on social media in terms of molding political opinions. And of course, it's an amazing tool. We're not going to, you know, put the horse back in the barn. You know, and I'm personally not a troglodyte or a technophobe, but you know, it was when Silicon Valley invented the internet, the presumption was this was all to the good. I mean, you would have multiple voices. People could basically access an infinite range of opinions. And in the spirit of John Stuart Mill, you know, the competition of ideas can certainly be good for freedom and democracy. It hasn't quite turned out that way, has it? In the sense that it's allowed for the siloing of opinions and people tend to reconfirm their own biases, and that's true for all of us too. We can't claim any innocence here. We reconfirm our biases by finding those points of view that basically sustain and support our own. You know, look, I wish, Jonathan, I had the answer to that. I think in terms of keeping ourselves sane, we have to find those media outlets and news reports that we think, in effect, are still trying to be, and there are many, still trying to be objective. There's no objectivity in reporting the news, we know that. But I think that some news media are better than others in terms of trying to deliver the news in a way that is, you know, not filtered towards ideology and try to be more objective. And I think what we simply have to do is use our own critical faculties to seek out those sites and inform ourselves from those rather than being ensnared, you know, sources of information. I have no magic answer to that. It's a very complex issue and a very important one. Yeah, I mean, back then, as I said, the medium of the day was the radio. When Roosevelt spoke, everybody had a radio and sat in their living rooms or kitchens and listened to Roosevelt, you know, give his fireside chats and his speech on the radio. Today, we have a much more pervasive media that I think in some ways, but you know, there were ideologues back then, you know, that used the media nefariously. I think of Father Coughlin, who had millions of followers on the radio out of Detroit. He was a rabid anti-Semite, okay, and was able to spew his hatred that way. So this is not totally a new phenomenon. It's just broader and more pervasive and more, and you know what I'm saying, in society. But we've always had hate mongers and so on, and extremists exploiting the media of the day to do it. Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. We have a comment in chat from Jim Norman. Many years ago, I had a junior high school history teacher, Daniel Hoteling, who maintained America is not, in fact, a melting pot. Rather, at our best, we are a stew pot, with each ingredient maintaining its own identity, but all contributing to the flavor.
Well, let me just say, you know, in many ways, I'm very interested in this. I've done some reading on it, Jim. In many ways, you know, we've been since the 60s, you know, American idea, since the 1840s, and Ralph Waldo Emerson commented on this, we've been a melting pot. That's been the prevailing ideology. I remember in elementary school singing songs to the melting pot in school. There are actually little ditties and tunes that praise the melting pot. Since the Black Power movement in the late 60s, we've changed, and the melting pot has competed with multiculturalism and the idea of hyphenated Americans who weren't just Americans. We were Greek Americans, Jewish Americans, Arab Americans, gay Americans, and so on and so forth. Where your people that rediscovered where their grandparents came from. But I got to tell you, that's not a new idea. As I said, John Dewey was a proponent of that pluralism, and Felix Adler in his own way was too. In the 1920s, I believe it was, there was a social theorist and a humanist by the name of Horace Kallen, who taught K-A-L-L-E-N. He was a Polish-Jewish immigrant who wrote a series of essays in the New Republic called Cultural Pluralism and the American Idea. Horace Kallen went on to teach at the New School and actually was a professor of our previous leader, Howard Radist. So he lived until, I think, the 1970s, although he wrote way before that. And Horace Kallen was an early proponent of a social ideology, a demographic that challenged the melting pot. He basically said that Americans come here, they do not necessarily homogenize. There are a lot of things they can forget, but they can't forget where their parents and grandparents came from. And he basically laid out a template for American society that stood against the melting pot, which he called orchestration. He said, as I did, and I'm willing to concede a great deal of this, that people choose to be socialized in their ethnic communities, their religious communities primarily, but he thought that in democracy flourish, these groups, like an orchestra playing different tunes, had to basically commune with each other. There had to be communication and discourse between the liberality and so on to reach out to others and just how the different ethnic groups in America, call them religious or racial, also in effect to harmonious American democracy. Okay, that's overstating it, but that's how in history melting pot has long been challenged as the prevailing ideology, although
Thank you. Our next question is from Janet Glass.
He couldn't possibly have anticipated the digital takeover and the robotic intrusion of jobs being taken over now by robots and having actually probably fewer actual jobs than they would have been otherwise. So that seems to me to point to a guaranteed basic minimum income, which I've long been in favor of. And of course, when Andrew Yang brought that up on the campaign trail, he was immediately dismissed as a socialist and had no teeth in it. How do we get back to that? And
well, maybe the current economic crisis, the fact, I mean, our government was able to churn out, the printing presses were able to churn out $2 trillion very quickly, weren't they, in order to give people a check, right, to tide them over, and Congress should be doing the same thing. So that idea, which sounded, outre when Andrew Yang proposed it, I think has gained a lot more traction as a result of the financial crisis brought to us by the pandemic. I think the pandemic has been maybe a major inflection point that, again, we've descended to the nether reaches of Hades, but I think we may rise again, right, to be able to grab onto these ideas that have gotten some traction, don't seem so kooky right now. I mean, they seem to have a great deal of traction. So again, I want to be hopeful. I think that this may be, if we can get beyond next week and reach the far shore in security, I think we may see a turning of America. I mean, Trumpism will be with us if he finally is able to be taken out of that, the White House in handcuffs. He will basically torment us from exile, and so on, and he has his followers. But I think that I'd like to believe the American public, however disappointing it's been in the last 4 years, still knows which side the bread is buttered on, and we will come out better for it. I remain hopeful. Okay, I'm not despairing. I'm a nervous wreck at the moment, but hopefully if we can get beyond Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday and reach the far shore safely, I think we may see a turning point. And that idea may, indeed, that'll be put on the table. I think that, it won't be front and center, But again, I think universal health care, which has been around since not Franklin Roosevelt, but TR, since Theodore Roosevelt, it's taken a long time. But I think in the future, the near future, if not now, any candidate who doesn't run on universal health care, however we get there, I mean, I want to see single payer, but however we get there, unless you run on that ticket, I don't think it's going to fly politically. I think the American public has moved in that direction. So yeah, I think new progressive ideas will open up on the horizon. Yeah, thank you. Yeah,
Thank you.
I look forward to it. Yeah.
Thank you. We have a question from Elaine or Dan, and then there also is a conversation going on in the chat, which we'll address after Elaine and Dan.
So, Joe, I liked your very eloquent presentation, and I agree with your medicine. I'm not sure I agree with your diagnosis. And in about the first half of your talk, you spoke of the we, the sense of community,
right,
that has been destroyed by Reaganism, et cetera.
Right.
And yet, I have to look at, let's say, Jamel Bouie's piece in today's Times Sunday Review to argue that we, that quote we, has never been inclusive.
Mm-hmm.
Never have been, not
Right.
just since the 1980s, but
Right.
never in American history.
Sure.
And I think of all the work we've been doing in the Society on White Privilege to suggest that if we speak in terms of that, quote, we, unquote, lots of people who've been excluded from that we in their lifetimes and in their ancestors' lifetimes are not going to hear us. And granted, those aren't the people who are voting for Trump for the most part. But if we seek to expand our reach and our participation as a society, we have to be mindful of how that communitarianism has to be phrased and framed
Right.
in a way that recognizes that we has always been a very particular we. And even when we talk about, as you did later, the more local we of the engagement in civic society, it's quite easy to be deeply engaged in the Ku Klux Klan. It's quite easy here in Teaneck. We have lots of the most engaged people who are interested in preserving private school rights as opposed to supporting the public school. And I assure you, they are deeply engaged in civic society. So I think it has to be, I wonder how you would respond to the issue of exactly how we define that we and how we define that engagement.
Right. Well, I agree with both of your points. I mean, there's no, let me just say up front, there's no golden age. I didn't mean to imply it. I'm talking in theoretical terms. And I agree with you 100%. I think reality is complex. Social reality is complex. Racial reality is complex. The notion of economic reality and hierarchy and who's in and who's out, who's marginalized and who we're talking about is something that has to be subject to very nuanced, sensitive discourse. I agree with you. I believe in nuance. I don't believe in blunt categories. Okay, I believe reality is complex, and we have to basically fine-tune our strategies and our rhetoric and our outreach to those nuances. When it comes to, again, this is why I laid out at the end the ideal of cosmopolitanism. Yes, the Ku Klux Klan member will find a great deal of, and the gang member and the member of white supremacist groups of all types, as well as fundamentalist religious communities, will find a validation of their values with their own to the exclusion of those on the outside. That's why I think, and I don't know how to get there, it's a long road. That's why I lay out as an ideal template the notion of cosmopolitanism, that one has to, in effect, if I'm a member of in effect, a conservative religious community, and I'm reinforced through my membership in it, as an American, I have a right to do that. It's not, Constitution doesn't lay out a demographic template for the United States. I have the right to do it. But I would like to believe that those people, if they live in Teaneck, for example, also feel a wider obligation to the entire TNEC community, and so on and so forth. And when it comes to voting for public schools, okay, they will be willing to pay taxes to support other people's children, not merely their own, even if they go to parochial schools, to give you one example. And that in effect, cosmopolitan, and it's a liberal view, what can I tell you? It's a liberalizing liberal worldview. Hopefully that cosmopolitan view would erode the type of allegiance that someone would have to a totally insular, intense hate group like the Klan or any other white supremacist group. I would like to believe that the white supremacists, and occasionally you see these guys on TV who have forsworn their allegiance to white supremacy groups, realize they've made a mistake, and are engaged in dialogue with African Americans, right? That is possible, and it's that basic liberal, sensibility of recognizing the humanity of the other, good ethical culture value that I think needs to be infused throughout the American social fabric. Okay, are we going to get there tomorrow? Of course not, right? Is it an ideal to look forward to inspire us? I think it is, but we have to do it with nuance and care in its implementation. So I agree with you.
Thank you.
As I usually do, Dan. All right.
So the chat that is going on, the chat conversation that's going on is with Peter Katsouras, Ron Schwartz, Sylvia Acosta have made comments regarding a possible civil war that may happen as a result of election, either side winning or losing. And the question is, should we be going to the streets to protest this? Ron is saying that he's going to be addressing this more in next week's platform, but wondering what your comments are regarding outcomes.
Oh my goodness, it's very dangerous to be a prophet. Nobody can foretell the future, okay, in that regard. I think there's a great deal of apprehension. We've already seen some violence. I don't know if you've read that Trump supporters ran a Biden bus off the road in Texas, okay, and as a result, the Biden campaign had to cancel two rallies as a result of doing that. So there already is violence. Donald Trump has stoked violence. He has legitimated it. It could not be more dangerous, and we may see violence. I'm fairly confident, however, and this may be wishful thinking, and I don't want to be proven wrong, that the major share of our law enforcement, okay, authorities will indeed be on the correct side of this and be basically, and I'm sure these discussions are going on in every sheriff's office and police department and in the FBI. They did a very good job of rooting out those conspirators who were, who were going to kidnap Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan, and so forth. I have a feeling that law enforcement will still be on the right side of this and do what they can to try to confront and quell the violence. Will we see it? Yes, I think we will see some violence. I just hope it is not widespread. Let me just say, if it comes down to this, and I hate to discuss America in these terms, I mean, I've done some reading on this, and the upper echelons of the military, if forced to choose between obedience to their commander-in-chief or obedience to the Constitution, are committed, as far as I can tell, to obedience to the Constitution, okay, and not to Donald Trump. They know, again, where the bread is buttered and which side they come out on. When you look at, the history of the Cold War, most coups d'etats are basically engineered by the military, and it's a ironic and fretful notion that we've come to the point where we may have to look to the military to save us, in effect, in this country. But I don't think it'll come to that point. Okay. Again, I'm not a Pollyanna. It's not merely wishful thinking. I just think that there's enough traction in the police forces at various levels in America not to permit violence to get out of hand. But I think we will have some, and it can get pretty ugly and pretty dangerous. By the way, in terms of protest, I think we should be out in the streets. The election will most likely not be decided on election day. Donald Trump may lose. I think he will, but he won't concede. We can be fairly sure of that, and we may not know the results until a few days after the election. I think it's important. There's a demonstration in Teaneck at 4 o'clock at the Municipal Green. I'm going to be there. And I would encourage our members, part of a national movement. I think it's important to be out in the streets and basically, again, express, if nothing more, express our solidarity for the importance of being out there. Hopefully we won't be taking any risks. We have to be self-protective. But I think the issue is dire enough and important enough to put ourselves on the line. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
That's
and
civic engagement, by the way. That's democracy in the civic, at the level of civic society, civil society, and I think we should exercise it. Good democratic practice. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So the